mysticism, and then, of course, Christianity came after that. So it also developed within Christianity and then in Islam. So what are the common threads there? Do you see any commonality? What is the common things between Jewish mysticism, Christian mysticism, and Sufism, mysticism that developed under Islam?
Samina?
One thing in my studies that I learned from these more ancient practices is that all of them, these mystical schools of thought, preach the relationship of the individual with the divine. There is no intermediary, there is no priest, there is no other person, there's no clergy. You have to take this path. If you take this path of embarking on a journey towards the divine, it is yours and yours alone. So the obstacles that you encounter on the path towards the divine are the different stages in your journey. In Christianity, it's called the 7 stages of the cross. In the Kabbalah, there is another whole version. And for in the Islamic tradition, it is, reaching to be a wali, to be able to speak with authority to the divine. These are all layers of thought, and I think Islam, after all, is Ahle Kitab. It has taken many of these traditions.
Okay, thank you. Let's have another few questions and then...
Yes, Peter, I think you said something to the effect that you Pakistanis will have to keep up the tradition of Sufism, not foreigners. What did you mean by that?
Can we take a few questions and then you can answer? Because otherwise there are many hands at the back. So, I'll remind you of the questions.
Can I respond?
Yeah.
All right. What I mean to say is that it's a very complex situation. You have in every society, you have dissidents and deviants and different kinds of cults, and there is no society which is totally uniform, one language, one belief, and so on. So you have to allow for these people and look also for the dissidents. And what happened in Europe is that those people who were not in unison with the Christian church, they were sort of pushed out of society, and they were not allowed the sacred spaces anymore. So they became, if you look for these people nowadays, you see people who, that's Malangs and Darwishes minus the tradition and minus the belief. So these are poor beings who are sitting in the pedestrian area, drinking and asking for alms, but they have been pushed out, and and that's very bad for society to do that with the obvious results. So what I mean to say is that in your country, you have managed to keep these people within society, to keep them alive, which actually means to feed them, to listen to them, to appreciate them. And this is something which foreigners cannot do. The foreigner, in Frankfurt or New York, there can be a great Sufi concert, there can be a conference, there can be a Rumi reading and so on, but this will not help the tradition to survive. That rests upon society of these countries.
Thank you for that excellent point, Mr. Pankey. My question is for Wasim Saab. What do you think of this new relationship developing between liberalism and Sufism? A few years ago, Zalmay Khalilzad's wife said that Sufism is the soft face of Islam. Rather than the heart of Islam, it's being seen as the soft face of Islam. And if we think about our own history, recent history, many practices in Sufism were rejected by the liberal Aligarh generation, so to speak, this superstition. But suddenly we see a lot of liberals jumping on board for this idea. Do they really understand what Sufism is?
Yeah, thank you. A very important question, because sometimes I have also the feeling that to some extent the West is a bit of hijacking the concept of Sufism and labeling it as soft and liberal and the right face of Islam, which they would love to support in any case. One thing is definitely so that Sufi tradition, to avoid this ism or this Sufi tradition, we have to say it in a plural. It's really a very broad spectrum with very diverse, at times diverse points of view and thoughts and devotional practices. So I think also Michel highlighted that the Sufi tradition, we can't idealize it. We should never essentialize it and see it as constructed out of different streams. And yeah, that's right.
Get another question?
Yeah, the aesthetic aspect of shrines notwithstanding, there's also social dynamics to it. The whole silsila concept associated with it, the silsila Naqshbandiya and the Sorwardiya and Qadriya. So, I mean, you know, there's the descendant of, you know, a certain peer who then inherits the mantle and passes it on. Does that not lead to a certain politics or dispossession, just as the feudal system does? I mean, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister of Pakistan, for instance, are peers in their constituencies. And I mean, does that not also need to sort of be seen?
I think this issue was already touched upon by Samina's presentation earlier, in which she had said that these shrines and spaces were not free of social ills and problems of you know, the lineage and the whole dynastic thing that you've pointed out. But I think those are practices which have evolved in, you know, as a function of the culture and the context. They are not part of the core principles of Sufi belief. So if there is a Gadi Nashin, it's not Sufism.
But when we say that it leads...
I'm sorry, we can't have a discussion because Mr. Zahid Hussain, we have to take a question from him. Mic le jaiye wahan pe, please. Jaldi, jaldi. And then Shahid Saab, and then we'll close. Okay.
It's a continuation of the previous question about the form of Sufism which we see in Pakistan. Don't you think it's a complete decadent form of, or has become in a way a tool of exploitation in the hands of big feudal lords? If you see in Sindh or even in Punjab, how you equate this Sufism with the one actually which we have been talking about?
Who's going to tackle that? Okay, Samina, please.
You know, I think that's a very valid point. It's the one that I was talking about, that there is an undercurrent of lethal mix of bad practices. And I think that's a very, very important point, that you have to differentiate between the fraudulent manipulation of these traditions and the tradition itself. Therefore, one of the things that our country really needs to look at is religious illiteracy. It's not just illiteracy, but religious illiteracy. What does Islam really ask of us? What are the central tenets? If we knew that, we would be better judges of this kind of practice that Zahid just has brought out, because people are manipulated because there is a vacuum of information, and it is pernicious, it is wrong, and it is very, very different from the teachings that should be inspiring us and that we should be learning from. Let us please not learn from taking money for minnats and doing this kind of strange activity or offering bribes. It's wrong.
And you can't bribe God anyway. So can we go to Shahid Saab now?
I think we should separate the pro-establishment and the Gaddi Nashin and shrine politics and culture, which is actually a part of the feudal politics, and the message of Sufis, especially the Sufi poets, which in this session we haven't really talked about. The message which they give, there are two very important things, apart from the spirituality and apart from their interpretation of man's relationship with God. The one is they are rooted in our culture and our tradition, our language, and that is in contrast to the religious interpretation of the Salafi or Wahhabi or more narrow-minded interpretation of literalist interpretation of Islam. And the second is their defiance of the authority and the rulers. And in that way, I think they are more relevant. The message of Sufi poets of Punjab and Sindh and their political confrontation or alternative they provided to the people. So I think these two issues, in my view, must be highlighted in the present political context. Thank you.
And so I hope that also tackles partly your question earlier. And as always, we'll go to Naseem Zehra will have the final word, and that's the last question, please. ये माइक ले लीजिए जरा.
What Zahid said and what was earlier said, I think that yes, we need to differentiate, because you do have popular shrines like Abdullah Shah Ghazi, you have Sevan Sharif and you others, where you don't have politicians, partake of that status, etc. The way you've had the Prime Minister appropriate people like Javed Hashmi. It's interesting if you look at the trajectory, when some of these people are essentially nobodies, and then title upon title upon title they appropriate. So I think that's where the politics of all of that comes in, and it seems to me that I think at some level ordinary people do recognize the difference, but the beauty and the power of Sufism still remains intact, I think, as Samina was saying.
Thank you very much. And I think we must close this session now, because I'm getting all sorts of alerts, and thank you for being here and for an excellent discussion to all the panelists as well. लंबा हो गया. यार मुझे भी अरे हाँ